Imagine a room in late 19th century Vienna. The address is Berggasse 19. The air is thick, almost unbreathable, heavy with the pungent, sweet smoke of a dozen cigars. The walls are lined with ancient Egyptian and Greek artifacts, statues of dead gods staring blindly into the gloom. In the center of the room sits the most famous piece of furniture in the history of psychology, a plush Persian rug draped over a psychoanalytic couch. Behind the couch, out of the patient's sight, sits the oracle of the modern age, Sigmund Freud. This is the man who taught us that we are strangers in our own minds. He told us that our innocent slips of the tongue are actually hidden confessions. He taught us that our dreams are encrypted letters from our deepest traumas and that our childhoods are psychological crime scenes. He mapped the unconscious and crowned himself its first great explorer. But if you zoom in on the great doctor, the myth begins to crack. Look closely at his jaw. It is rotting. He has endured dozens of agonizing surgeries for oral cancer, yet he uses a crude wooden clothespin to pry his jaw open just to force another cigar into his mouth. Look at his early career, fueled not just by ambition, but by staggering amounts of pharmaceutical cocaine. Look at the trail of broken friendships, brilliant disciples he banished the moment they dared to disagree with him. How does the man who invented the cure for neurosis become a slave to a white powder and a burning leaf? How does the man who decoded the human ego remain completely blind to the monstrous size of his own? Today, on Deconstructing Minds, we are committing the ultimate psychological taboo. We are flipping the room. We are putting Sigmund Freud on his own couch. We are going to psychoanalyze the Father of Psychoanalysis. We will explore his terrifying obsession with death, his pathological need for control, and the golden child syndrome that made him a genius, but also a tyrant. Brace yourselves as we deconstruct the mind that tried to deconstruct us all. To understand the colossal ego of Sigmund Freud, we must look at the woman who built it, his mother, Amalia. Born in 1856, Sigmund was the first child of his mother, who was 20 years younger than his father, Jacob. In a cramped, chaotic apartment filled with younger siblings, Sigmund was treated like a visiting deity. Amalia called him mein goldener Sigi, my golden Sigi. When young Sigmund complained that his sister's piano practicing disturbed his reading, his mother didn't tell him to compromise. She had the piano physically removed from the apartment. He was the only child allowed to have a private room and an oil lamp for reading, while the rest of the family studied by the dim light of cheap candles. Psychologically, this is the textbook definition of the golden child syndrome. Freud himself later wrote a chillingly accurate self-assessment. A man who has been the indisputable favorite of his mother keeps for life the feeling of a conqueror, that confidence of success that often induces real success. But this kind of maternal worship comes with a dark side. It creates a narcissistic grandiosity. Freud grew up believing he was destined to be a messiah. He didn't just want to be a doctor, he wanted to be a conquistador of human nature. In the 1880s, desperate for a medical breakthrough that would make him famous and allow him to marry his fiancée Martha, Freud discovered a new, little-known drug, cocaine. He didn't just study it, he worshipped it. He wrote a paper called Über Coca, on coca, calling it a magical drug. He took it to cure his depression, to help his digestion, and to give him the energy to work through the night. He sent vials of it to his future wife, telling her he would return to her a big, wild man who has cocaine in his body. But then his ambition triggered a tragedy. Freud had a close friend and brilliant colleague, Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow. who had developed a severe addiction to morphine after a surgical accident. Freud, blinded by his absolute belief in his own genius and his new miracle drug, prescribed massive doses of cocaine to Ernst to cure his morphine habit. The result was a medical and psychological catastrophe. Ernst didn't just stay addicted to morphine. He became Europe's first recorded cocaine addict. He suffered from horrifying cocaine psychosis, experiencing tactile hallucinations, feeling white snakes crawling under his skin. Freud had to sit up with his friend through agonizing nights of delirium, watching the man he tried to save spiral into madness and eventually die. How did the future father of psychoanalysis handle this catastrophic failure? Did he admit his narcissistic overreach? No. Psychologically, Freud engaged in massive repression and rationalization. He quietly erased his heavy involvement with cocaine from his later autobiographical writings. He buried the guilt so deep in his unconscious that it would only surface years later in his famous anxiety-ridden dreams, like the dream of Irma's injection, where his sleeping mind desperately tried to acquit him of medical malpractice. The man who taught the world that repressed trauma destroys the subject was walking around with the ghost of Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow locked in the basement of his own mind. As Sigmund Freud moved into his 50s, psychoanalysis was no longer just a medical theory. It had become a movement. And to Freud, it was something even more profound. It was his personal empire. He gathered a small, fiercely loyal group of followers in Vienna, meeting every Wednesday in his smoke-filled waiting room. To the outside world, it was the Psychological Wednesday Society. But psychologically, it functioned remarkably like an intellectual cult. Freud even gave his most trusted disciples matching gold rings engraved with Greek intaglios. He was the unquestioned high priest, and his theories on infantile sexuality and the Oedipus complex were the absolute gospel. But a king needs an heir, and Freud found his in a brilliant, towering young Swiss psychiatrist named Carl Gustav Jung. Freud was mesmerized by Jung. He called him his adopted eldest son, his crown prince and successor. Jung brought prestige, endless energy, and, crucially for Freud, he wasn't Jewish. Freud was paranoid that psychoanalysis would be dismissed by anti-Semitic Europe as a Jewish national affair, and Jung was his ticket to global Aryan respectability. But the relationship was doomed by Freud's own authoritarian narcissism. Freud's entire theoretical universe was built on the Oedipus complex, the idea that the son subconsciously wishes to kill the father to take his place. In a twist of supreme psychological irony, Freud began to project his own theory onto his relationship with Jung. As Jung matured, he began to question Freud's absolute obsession with sexuality. Jung wanted to explore mythology, religion, and what he would later call the collective unconscious. To a normal scientist, this is the natural evolution of ideas. To Freud, it was heresy. It was intellectual patricide. The tension reached a terrifying climax. Twice in Jung's presence, once in Bremen in 1909 and again in Munich in 1912, Freud literally collapsed and fainted. Why? In Munich, they were arguing about ancient Egyptian pharaohs erasing the names of their fathers from monuments. Freud suddenly accused Jung of harboring subconscious death wishes against him. The anxiety of being killed and replaced by his intellectual son was so overwhelming that Freud's body simply shut down. This is a staggering moment of somatization. The man who claimed to have absolute mastery over the unconscious was physically paralyzed by his own unresolved paranoia and his terrifying fear of usurpation. Freud couldn't handle peers. He could only handle disciples. When Jung finally broke away to form his own school of analytical psychology, Freud didn't just excommunicate him. He erased him. He diagnosed Jung's independence as a neurosis. Freud showed us that even the ultimate decoder of the human ego was entirely captive to his own. If Freud's mind was an impenetrable fortress, his body was a crumbling ruin, destroyed by a demon he invited in and refused to evict: the cigar. Freud smoked up to 20 cigars a day. He called them his work tool, his capacity for life. But in 1923, at the age of 67, he noticed a growth in his mouth. It was leukoplakia, which rapidly developed into an aggressive, agonizing squamous cell carcinoma, jaw cancer.
Over the next 16 years, Freud endured 33 brutal surgeries. Parts of his jaw, his soft palate, and his cheek were sliced away. To separate his nasal cavity from his mouth so he could eat and speak, he had to wear a massive, torturous prosthetic device that he grimly referred to as the monster. It had to be forced in and out of his mouth daily, causing him excruciating pain. He couldn't chew properly. His speech became thick and nasal. Toward the end, the necrotic tissue smelled so terrible that his favorite dog, a chow-chow named Jofi, refused to stay in the room with him. And yet, he never stopped smoking. The man who had written volumes on the pleasure principle, the man who built his career explaining how human beings use rationalization to hide their self-destructive urges, could not stop forcing cigars into a mouth that was literally rotting away. When his doctors warned him it would kill him, he simply found new doctors. This is the ultimate tragic display of psychological denial and compulsion. He proved that intellectual insight does not equal behavioral control. You can understand all the gears of the machine, and the machine will still crush you. It is no coincidence that during this period of horrific physical decay, amidst the backdrop of the slaughter of World War I and the tragic death of his beloved daughter Sophie to the Spanish flu, Freud introduced his darkest and most controversial theory. In his 1920 book, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud proposed Thanatos, the death drive. He argued that inside every human being, running parallel to the desire for sex and life, eros, is a profound subconscious desire to return to the inorganic state, a desire to destroy, to dismantle, to die. The psychoanalytic establishment was shocked. Many rejected it. But on Deconstructing Minds, we have to ask, was Freud describing a universal truth of the human condition, or was he projecting? Was Thanatos just the psychological alibi of an old, grieving man trying to rationalize his own suicidal addiction to cigars and the terrifying decay of his own flesh? He looked at his own inability to stop destroying himself, and he projected that fatal flaw onto the entire human race. By the 1930s, the world that Freud had so meticulously analyzed was plunging into a collective psychosis. In 1933, the Nazis took power in Germany, and Freud's books were among the first to be thrown into the roaring bonfires. When he heard the news, Freud reportedly displayed a grim, ironic, stoic denial, remarking, "What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages they would have burned me. Now they are content with burning my books." But the fire was coming closer. In March 1938, Hitler annexed Austria. Swastikas hung from the buildings of Vienna. The Gestapo roamed the streets. Freud was not just a prominent intellectual. He was the most famous Jewish scientist in the world, the architect of what the Nazis called degenerate Jewish science. Yet Freud refused to leave. His friends, his disciples, and diplomats begged him to flee. Why did he stay? Psychologically, it was a staggering display of narcissistic anchoring and denial. Vienna was his empire. Der Gasse 19 was his throne. To run away was to admit that the irrational, savage forces of the world were stronger than the rational intellect he had championed his entire life. He could not accept that the id of a nation had completely overpowered its ego. It took a terrifying shock to break his denial. The Gestapo arrested his beloved daughter, Anna.
They held her for a day, interrogating her. Freud paced his study in agony, realizing that his fame could not protect his blood. When Anna was released, the illusion shattered. Freud finally agreed to leave for London, but only after paying extortionate ransoms to the Nazi regime. Even as his world collapsed, Freud used his final years to settle his oldest, most deeply rooted psychological score. In London, dying of cancer, he published his last and most controversial book, Moses and Monotheism. In it, he argued that Moses was not Jewish, but Egyptian, and that the Israelites had murdered him in a primal rebellion, later inventing a single omnipotent God out of subconscious guilt.
Freud declared religion to be a universal obsessional neurosis. But look closer at the man writing this. To Freud, God was simply the ultimate projection of the Father, and Freud had a deep, unresolved father complex. When Sigmund was a young boy, his father Jacob told him a story. Jacob had been walking down the street when an anti-Semite knocked his new hat into the mud and shouted, "Jew, get off the pavement!" Young Sigmund eagerly asked his father what he did in response. Jacob quietly replied, "I stepped into the mud and picked up my cap." Freud was disgusted. The hero of his childhood had revealed himself as weak, passive, and submissive. Psychologically, Freud spent the rest of his life compensating for Jacob's humiliation. He built a towering, aggressive intellect so no one could ever knock his hat into the mud. By writing Moses and Monotheism, Freud wasn't just analyzing religion. He was performing an Oedipal assassination on a cosmic scale. He was killing the ultimate father figure in the sky, proving once and for all that Sigmund Freud bowed to no man and to no God. In September 1939, as the bonds of World War II began to fall, the war inside Freud's own body reached its final, agonizing stage. The cancer had eaten through his cheek, creating an open wound that emitted an odor so severe his bed had to be covered with mosquito netting to keep the flies away. He was 83 years old. He weighed barely 90 pounds. But even at the absolute edge of human suffering, Freud refused to surrender his agency. Years earlier, he had made a solemn pact with his personal physician, Dr. Max Schur. Freud had made Schur promise that when the time came, he would not let him suffer pointlessly. He demanded that he not be tortured just to extend his life by a few miserable days. On September 21st, Freud took Schur's hand and said, "My dear Schur, you remember our first talk. You promised me you would not help me not to be tortured. Now it is nothing but torture and makes no sense." Schur nodded. He administered a heavy dose of morphine. 12 hours later, he administered another. Sigmund Freud slipped into a coma and died peacefully on September 23, 1939. This final act is perhaps the most defining psychological moment of his life. Even in the face of Thanatos, the death drive he himself had theorized, Freud demanded the steering wheel. He did not let cancer kill him. He did not let God or nature dictate his end. He ordered his own death with the cold, clinical precision of a man who had spent a lifetime trying to conquer the uncontrollable. It was the ultimate assertion of the ego over the abyss. On Deconstructing Minds, our autopsy of Sigmund Freud reveals a truth that is both terrifying and profoundly human. Freud was not the objective, detached, flawless scientist he wanted the world to see. He was a man who preached the cure for addiction, yet was enslaved by cigars and haunted by his cocaine past. He was a man who decoded the ego, yet ruled his inner circle like a paranoid tyrant. He was a man who unmasked the illusions of humanity, yet used his theories as a shield to hide his own deep-seated fears of death and weakness. But this does not diminish his genius, it explains it. Sigmund Freud did not map the universal human mind.
He mapped his own mind, with all its brilliant, twisted, power-hungry and fearful corridors. And he did it with such overwhelming literary force that he convinced the rest of the world we were living inside it. He was a flawed, suffering human being who turned his own psychological wreckage into a mirror for the 20th century. He forced us to look into the dark, and for that we can never look away.